Thanks for being with us for Borderless Conversations Live with Stern Law. It's good to be with you, and I'm really excited that Erika Gomez, our senior paralegal from Stern Law, was really enthusiastic about joining today to talk with you about TPS from Venezuela. Erika, tell us a little bit about why you really found it important to share this information with fellow Venezuelans.
Sure. Well, as it was shared before, while we were advertising a little bit our Facebook Live today, I was born in Venezuela. My family is from Venezuela. I was born and raised there until I was 14 years old when we came to the U.S. So even though it's been a long time since I left, I still very vividly remember what life is like over there. I have close family and friends who still live in Venezuela. I'm familiar from firsthand experience, and not just my own experience, but the experience of my family, who I worry about often in Venezuela. So hearing about the news for TPS for Venezuela was a big deal, and I just wanted to make sure that people understood it, they knew about it, those who are eligible to apply for it, do it in a timely fashion, they don't miss the opportunity. And just having gone through an immigration experience myself, whether it be TPS or any other immigration process, I just know there's a lot of questions that, applications can be very meticulous and detailed when it comes to answering questions. They can be confusing. And so whatever help we can provide for people to understand how to navigate the process I know it's for someone, it could be a big deal.
Absolutely. And just information out there, right? The applications itself can be confusing, but even just knowing whether this applies to me, or is this something that is possible for me? How does this relate to maybe something else that I've filed already, like Asylum? So we're going to be talking this afternoon about, what is TPS? How is it different from DED, which we came to learn more about under the Trump administration? And then how is it different from Asylum? And how can we help those of you who are watching this to understand whether this might apply for you? And we'll talk a little bit in English and in Spanish to make sure that we're, covering those of you who need this information. So we'll go ahead and get started. First, we're going to talk about what is TPS, right? So, Erika, in general, what is TPS? What does it stand for? What is it?
Right. So TPS stands for Temporary Protected Status. And what it is a protection from deportation, even if you're not currently in deportation proceedings, due to the circumstances of your home country. So whether it be natural disasters in the case of a couple of the Caribbean countries, or in the case of Venezuela because of the political uprising and everything that's going on with the regime over there. And it's a protective status that is given to the people of Venezuela, in this case, for a specific amount of time. And it protects you from being deported during that time were you ever to face deportation proceedings. And it also gives you the opportunity to obtain a work permit, a social security number. And in many states, like in Georgia, those two things allow you to have a driver's license. So it just gives you the opportunity to obtain documents to be able to work, to be able to just carry out your daily life a little bit easier and in a legal way. And it allows you to obtain employment, maybe buy a house.
A lot of benefits. ¿Puedes decirlo en español también?
Sí, claro. Para aquellos que nos ven en español, estamos hablando un poquito acerca de lo que significa el TPS. Y el TPS, sus siglas significan estatus protegido temporal. Y lo que es un estatus protegido temporal es una protección de deportación sin que necesariamente tenga que estar en un procedimiento de deportación activo, lo que significa que no lo pueden remover a su país de origen durante el tiempo que el TPS esté activo. También le permite obtener documentos como, por ejemplo, un permiso de trabajo, un seguro social, y como mencionamos hace un minuto, por ejemplo, en el estado de Georgia, por lo menos, esos dos documentos le permiten obtener una licencia de conducir. Entonces, la protección de la deportación junto con estos documentos le permiten a la persona poder llevar una vida normal, más llevadera, más tranquila y sobre todo de manera legal.
Pero no es un estatus formal, ¿sí? No, it's not a legal status TPS, right? So can you describe a little bit the difference between having legal immigration status, like residency, versus having this temporary protected status, which is a program?
Right. So, permanent residency is an actual legal status. So it allows you to be in the U.S. Permanently without many restrictions. TPS, like you said, is not an actual legal status, even though it has the word status in it. But
You have to confuse people this way. I don't know.
right. But I guess what we need to focus on in the TPS rather than the status, we need to focus in the T in the temporary part, which is you're just protected from deportation and allowed to receive those benefits, like we talked about, the work permit and the Social Security, driver's license, for a specific period of time. And in a minute, we can go into a quick detail as to what that period is for TPS for Venezuela.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so just generally for those who are new to TPS or you're just joining us, it's really a short-term period of time where the government has provided a special program. It's not built into our law. It's not an actual legal status, but it's something that's circumstantial based on the circumstances of the country of origin at that moment, and that it's not safe to return. It's not really based on any long-term judgment or any promise of status in the US. It really is about what's going on right now and why is it unsafe to to return to that country. So let's talk about Venezuela. The circumstances there have been very difficult for a long time. What is it that you can share with those who may not be as familiar as to the circumstances right now and why it seems that the government relied on that in order to determine that TPS is appropriate for Venezuelans right now?
Yeah. So this political revolt that's going on has been going on for several years now, for over 20 years. And every year the situation gets worse. Back in the late 1990s, Hugo Chavez was elected president, and ever since his election, a dictatorial regime rose up. And for the last 20-something years, Venezuela has been under a very strict regime and limiting people's freedoms when it comes to their political views and affecting everything from their ability to obtain employment, their ability to freely express themselves, their ability to obtain housing, healthcare, and even food. And
it's gotten really worse over the last few years, where especially food insecurity has become such a challenge. What has really changed that's made it so much worse, where it's not safe any longer to return?
I think two things. One, and I think any Venezuela listening can relate to just how unsafe the country is altogether. The regime has basically abolished every kind of law that there was, and so there's no persecution of any kind of crime in Venezuela, really. So people can get kidnapped, robbed, hijacked in the middle of the street, and there will be no persecution from the government because of that. So yeah, there's no protection from the government, from the authorities. The authorities are intertwined with the criminal activity going on out in the streets. So there's really nobody that a Venezuelan citizen, nobody in a place of authority that a Venezuelan citizen can really trust to protect them. Besides that,
but the economy especially, right? Because there's a lot of countries where what you just described is a really sad reality. You see that a lot in Central America, but we're not seeing a TPS from all Central American countries, even though there may be a lot of gang violence or the government being wrapped up with some of the crime going on and corruption. So it seems like the circumstances there really have been put in a different category than some of these other countries. And it seems like the economy crumbling over the last few years has been like the last straw. Is that accurate?
Yeah, definitely. And in addition to that, the economy, how big of a hit it has taken, in addition to, I guess, because of the political views that the regime has and the lack of that same political view that a lot of people in the opposition have, that's made it very difficult for people who do not agree with the regime to obtain employment, housing, food. Everything has been so controlled to the point that you basically have to show your support for the government in order to get access to food, medical care, housing. And a lot of people are faced with the decision of foregoing everything that they stand for, that they believe in order to be able to survive. And I think that's what a lot of people haven't been able to deal with, and thus flee Venezuela. And I think that's probably the main, especially now during COVID times, and how little regard for it there was, and how little access to medical care there was in Venezuela, is probably one of the last straws that the U.S. government saw in trying to help Venezuelans overcome all these difficulties put together.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like having to make a decision between, a life or death situation, or not being able to have food. I mean, it's not a decision that anybody should have to make. So let's talk about who qualifies right now. So specifically talking about Venezuela, we got this good news a few weeks ago. Who qualifies for TPS?
Okay. So in order to qualify for TPS, you have to be a Venezuelan citizen, or you have to be someone without a specific nationality who last lived in Venezuela as your permanent place of residence. And you have to have lived continuously in the United States since March 8th, and you must have been physically present in the U.S. since March 9th of this year.
Okay, and this, I think, addresses a lot of what people are concerned about with new policies that are beneficial for immigrants from different countries. You had to physically be present in the United States before they announced this program. So this isn't something that's going to benefit anybody who's now coming to the United States because they heard about this program. It's only going to be possible for those who were already here, who already sought the protection of the United States, or maybe they were just here to visit, but at the end of the day, had to make that difficult decision of whether I should go back to these circumstances and put my life on the line. We can share those qualifications in Spanish as well.
Right. So, ahora hablando de nuevo para nuestros clientes o futuros clientes o quienes nos escuchen quien hablan español. Los requisitos para poder aplicar para el TPS son 3. Primero, tiene que ser una persona de nacionalidad venezolana o una persona sin nacionalidad que haya vivido en Venezuela por última vez como su residencia permanente, que Venezuela haya sido su país de residencia permanente antes de venir a los Estados Unidos. Tiene que ser alguien que haya estado continuamente en los Estados Unidos desde el 8 de marzo de este año, del 2021, y que haya estado físicamente presente en los Estados Unidos desde el 9 de marzo del 2021.
Okay, so then people from Venezuela are, Venezuelan citizenship or didn't have a country of origin, which is rare. If they were here on March 8th of this year and have continuously been here since, essentially, they qualify. What is it that needs to be done? What do people need to do in order to make sure that they're putting their application in and getting this TPS protection?
So it's thankfully very simple. There's not a lot involved in the process. What people need to do is fill out their application, and the application is the I-821, and you can find that in the USCIS website. You need to fill that out, and they will take you to a specific page where you can see where to file. There's different offices that you need to send the application to depending on where you live in the US. And if you want a work permit with your temporary protective status, which you don't need to have, but you're able to have if you wish to have one, then you can also include the work permit application, which is the I-765, and you send those two things together.
You don't want to forget that one, because that's going to actually give you the document that allows you to work and have proof of that status or the temporary program. And maybe when we explain why we need to file, we can do that first in English, and then we can share overall what to do with everybody. But it's important that you don't miss this opportunity, because there is a time limit. So what's the cutoff date by which people need to file?
Yeah, the registration is open, has been open since March 9th, and it will close on September 5th. So everybody who wants to apply has until September 5th to apply in a timely manner.
Okay, and there's only really about 18 months that you're getting this TPS for. Hopefully it's extended. We've seen that with other countries. TPS has been extended for years in some countries where it's still not safe to return.
Right.
Obviously, I'm sure all Venezuelans wish and want for it to be safe to return. People want to be in their home, in my experience. But if circumstances continue to be as they are or get worse, maybe the program will be extended, and we'll see that there's a re-registration period. But for now, make sure you file by September of this year, and it will be good until September of next year.
Right. So I'll take a quick second and share all this in Spanish. Estamos hablando rápidamente de cómo, cuándo registrarse para el TPS. Y lo primero que tienen que saber es cómo dirigirse a la página de internet de las oficinas de inmigración, USCIS. Y en la página de internet de USCIS le van a explicar dónde debe mandar su aplicación dependiendo de en qué estado de los Estados Unidos viva. Y lo que tiene que enviar a las oficinas de inmigración para poder obtener el TPS son dos cosas. La aplicación del TPS como tal, que es la aplicación I-821. Y si desea un permiso de trabajo, lo cual la mayoría de las personas desean recibir con el TPS, también debe incluir el formulario del permiso de trabajo llamado I-765. Y también incluir el costo de procesamiento de inmigración, y el costo varía dependiendo de su edad. Entonces, en la página de internet de USCIS también le va a especificar, dependiendo de su edad, cuál es el monto que debe de enviar para este costo de procesamiento a las oficinas de inmigración.
Gracias, Erika. In just a minute, we're going to talk about the difference between asylum and TPS. So if you're just joining in, you don't want to miss that, because I think this is one of the main questions that we get. And, there's a lot of relationship between Venezuela and asylum seekers at this moment. But before we do that, let's just briefly touch base on what is DED and how is TPS different. So DED came up really under the Trump administration regarding Venezuela. What's the difference, Erika?
Right. So DED is the Deferred Enforcement Departure, and that was signed by former President Trump right before he left office. And this is only a protection from deportation for anybody who received an order of deportation before January 20th of 2021. So if you were in deportation proceedings and were ordered removed by the immigration judge before January 20th of this year, then through this, you have protection from being deported.
Yeah.
However, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so basically the Trump administration acknowledged the circumstances that were going on in Venezuela at the time that DED was announced, but it didn't give any real benefit to people like TPS is. Instead, what it did was just say, look, you've been ordered deported, but we get it. We understand the circumstances in Venezuela are not secure right now, so we won't actually take action on your deportation order and make you leave. But it didn't give people work authorization or any sort of sense of longer term protection.
And in a lot of cases, not even the ability to be released from immigration custody if you were in custody. Because we've seen that with not necessarily Venezuelans, but we've seen that with other clients from different countries who were also protected from deportation after receiving the order of removal, but they were sort of stuck in this limbo where, okay, you're not going to be deported, but you're also not going to be released and not really going to have any benefits.
Yeah.
So contrary to that, TPS actually protects you from being deported, but in addition gives you the benefits that you can have to be able to live a normal life. Your work permit, a driver's license to go to work, to take your kids to school, to be able to, like I said, buy a house or whatever it is that you may need to just live your daily life with a little bit more peace and security.
Yeah. Let's talk about the difference between asylum and TPS. This is a big one. We talked about earlier that TPS is not an actual legal immigration status. It's not something that has any pathway towards residency or citizenship in the US. We're hoping that that changes with some of the bills that are pending in Congress right now, where potentially the lawmakers are considering having those that have TPS status or DACA for young arrivals under the Dreamers program, that they would have a path towards residency. But at this moment, that's the main difference, right? That there's not some sort of pathway towards permanent status, as opposed to asylum. Asylum is a pathway towards permanent status, but it is very different, and there's a lot of different requirements for asylum. Do you want to give a brief overview of the difference between?
Yeah, of course. So Venezuelans are not, like you said,
Strangers.
they're not strangers to asylum at all. But like you were mentioning, asylum, in addition to being a possible path to a permanent status in the US, also has very specific and different and very specific requirements. So you have to have been a victim of a very specific crime, and certain things needed to have happened prior and after that specific crime covered in the asylum law of the US to be able to obtain it.
As add in a little bit there just before we move on to TPS. So asylum, essentially, you have to be in a protected group of people with very specific circumstances, like Erika just mentioned. Either you have to have been persecuted or basically targeted based on your gender, your religion, your political affiliation, your sexuality, or being a member of a particular social group. It's a very high standard. It's really difficult to meet. And if you do, though, you do get granted legal status, and you have asylum status for 1 year. And then after that 1 year, you are eligible to apply for permanent residency and then move on to citizenship from that point. So
Right.
it's a much higher standard to prove somebody that's actually eligible for asylum. A lot of people apply, right? There's a lot of Venezuelans right now with pending applications. Some have been approved. The process takes years and years and years.
Yeah.
But it's not as likely to be approved for asylum because
Right.
the standard is just so high, as opposed to TPS, right? And so for those with TPS, how is that different?
Right. Yeah. And just to piggyback right a little bit on what you were saying really quick about asylum and how that differs from TPS, in addition to everything that you just mentioned, you have to prove things like the government in your home country was unwilling or unable to protect you from the crime that you were being persecuted for, or for the reason that you were being persecuted. And you had to show that the US was really the only place that could protect you. So for a lot of Venezuelans or anybody in an asylum circumstance who may have dual citizenship, that's not always a viable option, since you can show that another country can take you in and offer some protection. So contrary to that, for TPS, you don't have to show all of these things. The designation of TPS by the government basically means that the government has already determined that the situation in Venezuela is bad enough that Venezuelans need protection. So right, regardless of whether you were targeted particularly for any reason or you were a victim of just regular street crime caused by the political revolt that's going on. You don't have to show whether the authorities were able or willing to help you, and regardless of you having maybe a dual citizenship in another country, you can still apply for TPS. It's basically already been determined by the government that whatever the circumstances, they're bad enough that Venezuelans deserve to be protected, at least for a period of time until things start to get better.
Yeah.
So they don't have to worry about specific requirements other than what we've mentioned, which are very general.
Yeah, very
well and be here after a specific date.
Yeah. So there's pros and there's cons. There's a lot more benefits that come along with asylum, but it's so much harder to actually be successful with asylum cases. The percentage, the approval rate, I haven't checked in the last year, but it used to be, less than 5% really of asylums being approved. So it's just very difficult, and this is going to be an option for people that don't require that they jump through so many hoops and can give people a little bit more stability, at least knowing that through September of 2022, the U.S. has said we are going to protect you from having to return. We'll see what happens after that. In a few minutes, let's talk about some tips and factors to consider. Many of you may be considering whether you should be applying for asylum or whether you should be applying for TPS instead. There's some main factors that we want you to keep in mind. But please know that anything that we're saying right now is not legal advice. This is very general, informative education, and we don't know you or your circumstances, and immigration law, one little small difference in your circumstances can make a big difference in whether this is possible for you. So please keep in mind that if you do want us to evaluate your situation specifically, give us a call. Erika would likely be the one that's working on your case, and she understands what it is that you're going through, and we can definitely help you through the situation. But in general, right, some main factors to consider is that applying for TPS and applying for asylum can have impacts on each other, right? You want to share a little bit about that, Erika, in English?
Yeah. So to begin the contrast in these tips and factors, would like to first highlight that applying for one does not prevent you from applying for the other. So you can always apply for asylum if you think that you have a valid asylum claim, and also apply for TPS. So one does not prevent you from obtaining the other. The second thing that we've already mentioned, but it's definitely worth highlighting, is there's a very specific period of time during which you can apply for TPS. So go ahead and do not miss that deadline, because after that, you can still apply for TPS, but it becomes a lot harder. There's stricter rules if you don't apply during the registration period.
So even though you can apply for both, even though we said we weren't going to give any advice, I think we would say that if you're considering applying for both because you think you have a legitimate asylum claim, you should go ahead and apply for both, as opposed to just choosing one or the other, right? What are some of those reasons why we would typically recommend that?
Well, so there's something particular about TPS that we learned in the last few days, which is if you apply for TPS and your TPS application is granted, you have 1 year to apply for asylum. So let me back up a little bit so this makes more sense. You have 1 year to apply for asylum once you've arrived in the United States. And if during that year you choose to apply for TPS and that TPS is granted, then the 1 year clock for you to be able to apply for asylum is stopped. So even if the 1 year period of time has actually already passed, but you've obtained TPS status, even after that 1 year mark, you're still able to apply for asylum. But the reason why we're emphasizing that you should apply for both is there are several factors that neither an attorney or an applicant can control, and especially in COVID times, such as how long an application is going to take to be approved. So if for any reason your 1 year clock is already ticking and you file your TPS application, if it were to take more than that 1 year mark to get approved, or if it were to be denied for any reason, then you've lost that 1 year application, that 1-year mark.
It's a specific circumstance. So if somebody comes here from Venezuela and they've been in the US for 6 months, for example, and they're looking to apply for either TPS or for asylum, we're never suggesting that you apply for asylum if you don't have a legitimate claim for it. But if you do believe that you can prove that you would be persecuted personally, you individually yourself, persecuted because of your gender, your political opinion, your sexuality, your religion, or being a member of a particularized social group, then we're recommending that you do apply, even if you're also applying for TPS. Because if you apply for TPS after 6 months and your application takes 7 months to be approved, well, you've just missed the timeline to apply for asylum, right, Erika?
Sure.
Or if you apply for TPS and maybe you don't apply properly and it gets denied, well, then the clock is not stopping for your 1 year to file for asylum. It's only once it's been approved. It's only once your TPS application has been approved that the filing clock stops for asylum. So just carefully balance that out, talk to a lawyer about it, and just make sure that you're considering all of that before you give up your opportunity for asylum if you have a legitimate claim.
Right. And the very last one is, you may see in different places that TPS allows for something called advanced parole, which is permission from the government to leave the country and travel during a very specific amount of time. So while TPS does offer that option to leave the US and be able to come back, if you're thinking about filing for an asylum claim, you need to have in mind very clearly that traveling, especially to Venezuela, if you were to go back for any reason to see a family member or to take care of, whatever unresolved business you may have left before you came, if, like Jessica was mentioning just a minute ago, maybe you were here on vacation and your circumstances happened to where you had to stay. If in the future you choose to file that asylum application, having a record, having gone back to Venezuela, even if having done so legally, can have a big impact on an asylum application later.
Yeah,
so
think about it. If you're applying for asylum, you're saying I cannot go back to my home country because I'm going to be persecuted. I'm going to be targeted and arrested or harmed. And so if you then went back on this advanced parole permission while you have TPS to do something, whatever the reason is, it really weakens your claim that you're really afraid of returning back and that it's a reasonable claim. So these are the legal strategies that are really important for an attorney to work with you on, because sometimes advanced parole could really be beneficial for you because it can help sometimes to have a legal admission to the US so that you can later become a resident if you have a qualifying relative. Won't get into all of that right now, but we highlight this just because we want to make sure you understand that even though this application might look very simple online, there are laws behind all of these applications that allow for these applications to even be there. And the laws are what controls what happens with your life and whether you might still have an option in the future for something important like residency or asylum. So please do keep that in mind and talk to an attorney so they can help you balance those different legal consequences.
Right. So I'm not sure if we have a few minutes left to quickly go over this in Spanish.
Yeah, but in Spanish and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Entonces, lo último, para aquellos que nos escuchan en español, lo último que estamos conversando son unos tips para saber cómo manejar el TPS. Y como habíamos mencionado anteriormente, algo que ya dijimos, pero vale la pena recalcar, es no pierdan el periodo de registro para poder someter su aplicación de TPS. Ha estado abierto desde el 9 de marzo y cierra el 5 de septiembre. Entonces, asegúrense de consultar con un buen abogado si necesitan ser guiados un poco por medio de este proceso o consultar con la página de internet de USCIS para poder saber dónde enviar su aplicación y qué enviar. Lo segundo que habíamos conversado anteriormente con respecto al asilo es que una aplicación aplicar para una no le quita el derecho de aplicar para la otra. Entonces, cuando se aplica para el TPS y ese TPS es aprobado, en la fecha de la aprobación del TPS se para el periodo de tiempo de 1 año que tiene una persona para aplicar para el asilo. Sin embargo, siempre le recomendamos que si puede aplicar para ambos, y en un paréntesis hacemos siempre el comentario de que nunca le recomendamos a nadie que no tenga un buen caso de asilo con un buen fundamento aplicar para una aplicación de asilo o pedir un asilo, pero si lo tiene y tiene planeado pedir el asilo y es elegible también para el TPS, siempre le recomendamos hacer los dos para no perder la oportunidad de aplicar para el asilo por aplicar para el TPS. Y lo último que le estamos recomendando a la gente es el permiso de viajar que otorga el TPS. El TPS otorga lo que llaman en inglés un advance parole, que es solamente el permiso del gobierno para salir de los Estados Unidos y regresar. Y lo que le queremos recalcar, obviamente específicamente a los venezolanos, es, aun cuando el gobierno autoriza viajar fuera del país, tienen que tener mucho cuidado regresando específicamente a Venezuela, ya sea para ver a un familiar o si estaba, por ejemplo, como Jessica mencionó hace un minuto, de vacaciones en Estados Unidos y por cualquier circunstancia necesitaron quedarse y ahora pueden aplicar para el TPS, resolver cualquier asunto que se dejó sin resolver en Venezuela. Es riesgoso volver porque si en el futuro todavía tiene la oportunidad y aplica para una solicitud de asilo, ese viaje a Venezuela puede tener un impacto grave en su solicitud de asilo, ya que una solicitud de asilo significa básicamente no puedo regresar a mi país de origen porque me están persiguiendo, mi libertad, mi vida corre peligro. Entonces, aunque esta oportunidad existe de viajar, tengan mucho cuidado antes de hacerlo y consulten con un buen abogado.
Overall, we're really happy and comforted by the support that the government has shown to Venezuelans through TPS. We fully believe that people should be able to spend important moments with people that they love, with their family. Birthdays, weddings, deaths in the family. It's very difficult to not be able to be with your family in your home country. Many families are separated because of this. Some are not able to make the journey to the United States, and there are many people who are still suffering significantly in Venezuela. So our heart goes out to those who are impacted in this, whether positively or negatively, and we're hopeful that we'll start to see some more humane acts of kindness and humanity for those who are not able to safely return to their home countries. So thanks for joining us, and Erika, thank you for sharing and wanting to really make sure that information is getting out to Venezolanos, and that people understand the importance of taking advantage of the opportunity for TPS right now. And if we can be of help for anything else to help you understand it, we're here. And we wish everybody the best. Thank you.
Thank you.